Hello and welcome to this podcast for lecture number 6 on employability.
There's bad news and there's good news. What is the bad news? The bad news is that the job market is bad. All right? There's no way to sugarcoat this.
And the good news, he says, continues, is that we can all get a job nevertheless. And in a way, this is the whole setup for this topic. On the one hand, you have structural political conditions. You have no jobs. On the other hand, you have a discourse, or if you like, an ideology of employability, which puts a lot of responsibility on the individual, even in situations where the individual has very little agency, where the individual can do very little. So that is the backdrop, that is, in a way, the central theme for this lecture. So just starting off with the meaning, and the main thing here is to look how the meaning of employability has become more and more focused on the individual rather than on political solutions, which used to be the case in the early 20th century. So it's been a gradual shift towards thinking about employability as a responsibility of the individual. And an example of that is the Labour's New Deal in 1998, and which is coming out of a critique of the welfare state. Basically, it shouldn't be too easy if you're unemployed and maybe you are lazy or maybe you're not working hard enough to get a job. So that is the kind of vocabulary that came with the New Deal. And this is what some people have critically called a supply side fundamentalism. So supply side is where you focus only on the individual rather than thinking more broadly about political solutions. To understand what employability means, it's key to look at broader structural changes over the last 2 or 3 decades. And we looked at 3 scholars in particular. We started off with Richard Sennett, and he looks at the transformations on institutions, claiming how social, political institutions have become more and more fragmented, and the consequences this decline of institutions have had on people. And his claim is that it has made us more anxious, and it's ever more difficult to get a coherent life narrative. And there is a video on the blog that you could watch, a longer version.
Ordinary.
The other person that we're looking at is Andrew Ross, and he's making a similar claim. He looks at the transformation over the last 2 decades, characterized by deregulation and economic liberalization, and how this in a way has killed the image of the standard employment, and the stability that used to be the case for most employers has been replaced by self-employment. And he also points out how this is a trend that you could find not just in low-income sectors but also in higher-income sectors. And there's a longer video that you could see on the blog. Third is Guy Standing, and he looks at neoliberalism with its dislike for states, and how this has made more and more people to get into insecure situations where it's been incredibly difficult not just to get a job, but to get a job with a stable employment contract. And part of the precariat would include, there's a longer video on the blog, would include people in careerless workers. So he would say that people working in different form of low-wage occupations rarely get any upward social mobility from that work. So even though you could put it on your CV, it's not going to make much of a difference in terms of getting a better job as a result of it. So he's very skeptical and very critical of this transformation. We then looked at some examples of work that hardly pays anything or pays so little you can't really live on it. And it's important here to point out that employability is not just about getting yourself a job, it could also be about retaining a job. So if it is the case that we are now more and more living in precarious situations, as Guy Standing points out, then it's not just a matter of finding jobs, it's a matter of constantly making sure that you can retain the job you have, because probably you're not having a very stable work contract. That is the argument you find not just with Standing, but also Ross and Sennett. So anyway, examples of work that hardly pays anything would be low-wage work, and the trend has been that more and more people are working in this sector. And there's an interesting study done by Barbara Ehrenreich called Nickel and Dime, where she was going to Minnesota and taking up several jobs, one at Menards and another one at Walmart. And they working there hardly paid for her the motel she was staying, and then she needed a car because Walmart and Menards are usually located outside of the city, which she couldn't afford. And the result is the only way to survive was to turn to welfare. And there's a longer clip that you can find on the blog. Another example of work that hardly pays anything is internship, and more and more people are doing internship. And the trend is that people don't get any pay, and that they also do rather menial, pointless things that wouldn't develop them in any substantial way. There's a clip you can find on Ross Perlin in the on the blog, and I strongly recommend Andrew Ross' review of this book that you also can find on the blog.
And to some extent,
a final example is Workfare, and this is an initiative specifically designed to get people out of unemployment. And again, the trend here is that more and more people have been exploited. They've been working for free for places like Poundland or Tesco. Again, not learning anything, so it's basically just a question of free labour. Again, you have some good videos about this on the blog.
Now, a storm erupted.
Became obvious as soon as we got there.
Now, we're going to look at the ideology of employability, if you like, and you'd find videos like this.
Someone asked me the other day what I thought the greatest barrier to...
And she's making the claim that we should all be better at selling ourselves. So again, a person who would never acknowledge any political or structural factors or aspects being involved, but only putting the focus on the individual. There's a great book by Ivor Southwood, and you do have an excerpt from this that was part of your seminar reading. And he looks at this ideology of employability and claims that what you get is an ideology centering only on the responsibility of the individual. And this is very close to some of the themes that we covered in the topic of happiness, about positive psychology. Again, positive psychology being a kind of an ideology that puts a lot of the responsibility on the individual, even those things that are clearly outside of the individual's own control. A similar argument is made by Ophir Sharon, and there's a good scholarly article that he's written that you could find on the blog. And he talks about the depoliticization of unemployment, that this reluctance or inability to talk about external political factors is also a way of masking or concealing the political factors that are at play. That's another good reading to have a look at. Then we go on to look at psychological effects of employability. And Colin Cremin has written an interesting, although quite difficult article. Have a look at it, but the main thing to sort of take from this is how the focus on employability has, resulted in some kind of mouse and cat game where we become where all people are getting paranoid about how to behave in order to make sure that the boss, that is the metaphor he's using, that the boss is satisfied. So what can we do to please the boss's desire is kind of phrase that he would be using. And he would say that beneath this mask of employability, what you find is mere exploitation. Then you have Southwood, and he looks at the way in which people start to internalize a sense of worthlessness and how this is being reinforced by a constant and very strong sense of guilt, the guilt of not doing enough to be employable, even if you've done everything that you possibly can. And then Guy Standing is looking at anger, enemy, anxiety, and alienation as common psychological effects from being subjected to this ideology of employability. And then we looked finally on what's called A Lost Generation. And there's been a number of books coming out recently that is making the claim that the younger generation are having greater difficulties than their parents as far as getting jobs is concerned, but also getting houses, mortgages, and these things. And The Guardian even runs a special section called The Graduate Without a Future. And there's a number of really interesting clips that you'll find on the blog that is covering this. That was everything. Thank you.